Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, thank you to all of you who have joined us for today's webinar. Today we'll be bringing you the fourth webinar in the 2022 NACOL webinar series, a series designed to bring you information on the practice of civilian oversight, innovations in the field, and important work being done in the arena of criminal justice reform. Today we are honored to welcome Dr. David Makin, who has joined us to talk about how we can situate and best use body-worn camera footage in civilian oversight. Dr. Makin is an associate professor in the School of Criminal Justice and Criminology at Washington State University. And there he also serves as director of the Complex Social Interaction Lab, where they have processed over 25,000 hours of camera footage for police departments on projects that include improving the use of procedural justice, examining differential decision-making within police-community interactions, enhancing CIT training, and examining the application of trauma-informed practices within domestic violence contexts. Most recently, they have undertaken projects seeking to understand the use of de-escalation and non-escalation strategies and tactics. Before I turn things over to Dr. Makin, I just would like to remind all of you that you have entered today's session in listen-only mode. During the webinar, you will have the ability to type in any questions you might have. Those questions will then be posed to today's speaker following the presentation. I'd like to also remind you that today's webinar is being recorded and will be made available on the NACOL website at a later date. And with that, I welcome you, Dr. David Makin. David?
Yes, thank you very much. And I will apologize. I'm getting over a cold, so I might hack occasionally. I have a lot of cough suppressants, a lot of tea now. So I just wanted to make everyone aware of that. And it might not sound the best. So I appreciate certainly the opportunity to speak with you all, really highlight some of the work that we have been doing out here at Washington State University. It really has been a labor of love in many ways. Just being able to work with agencies on really kind of making sense of their body-worn camera video. I want to just, it wouldn't be an academic if we didn't talk a little theory. And I just wanted to leave you, kind of prime the conversation with these kind of 3 points. This idea is really kind of 3 schools of thought around technology. So the idea is, right, what is it, right? How do we think about technology? We know that there's supposed to be a problem, and then is there a technological solution to said problem? Right? And we know that if we implement technology, right, it should accomplish kind of 5 core things. It should allow us to be more efficient, more effective. It should allow us to better allocate our resources, deploy our resources, improve our accountability. But when we look at the kind of the history of technology, we've seen it kind of boiled down and kind of synthesized into these kind of 3 core elements. And so as we talk about body-worn cameras, we talk about, or you think about other types of technology, I want you to always kind of go back to and think about, well, is it really just this ploy by administrators to say, well, we have it, and call it like technological modernity, right? This idea that we're professional because we have it, not how it's used. We just have it, therefore we're professional. Is it something that is modifying practice? Right? Is it something that is transforming the organization? Does it have transformational properties? Right? Could it, right? Or is it simply we implement it, it replicates, and it doesn't really change the organization? There have been arguments that body-worn cameras have actually reflected all 3 of these. And in some areas, we're seeing the potential that it could modify, that it could transform. And so what I want to do is I want to share with you all, a little bit of our background and where we're seeing agencies that are, kind of working towards this idea that technology is modifying their practice, that it's allowing them to transform. And I think that with that, given this audience and given the remarkable work that you all do, there might be an opportunity to really kind of work with your agencies to be able to implement and use their body-worn camera programs to kind of the fullest extent. So this is just a snapshot excuse me, from BJS, from their primer on body-worn cameras, it really gets this idea that they are in use. And I want to purposely kind of highlight the fact that, yes, they are in use, right? We are seeing that, about half of agencies have them, right? Larger agencies predominantly have them. So they are in use. The question then is, really, are they used, right? Because it's one thing to have a program. It's entirely something else to make use of that program, right? To integrate it into your existing practices. So this is really kind of how the lab came to be. I might tend to overshare sometimes when I give these talks. And so the lab, interestingly enough, came about, during Thanksgiving. And so my research, partner out here at WSU, Dr. Willits, we were, meandering during, the Thanksgiving was being made, turkeys in the oven, about, all the training. Right? We train officers. And yet when we ask the question, is it working? We often get, well, we don't know. Attitudes change. We've been able to survey and we see attitudes shift. And we would ask, kept asking this and going, well, but does it change how an officer interacts in the field? And we could say, well, what if we had, agency buy-in? And we're pretty fortunate that, the Pullman Police Department, our local agency out here in Pullman, had a really progressive chief. And he said, David, I'm happy to work with you. We have, a lot that I'd like to learn. What do you need? And I said, well, I need access. And he said, I also need startup funds. And, small agency, well, David, I don't have the startup funds, but I can help you with access. And so WSU had these grand challenges. And so the idea of the grand challenges, they said, how can the research community, how can we, step in to help solve some big problems? I mean, these were big problems that had been identified, in our state. And one was around equity and justice. And that's big, right? You all in your roles are trying to impart oversight to improve equity and justice, right? Through transparency, accountability, right? Adherence to the rule of law. It's got core tenets of a justice system. And we were able to secure funds from this program. We were one of few researchers out here at WSU that received seed funding to create this lab. So all of a sudden we had funds, we had buy-in from an agency, our very first agency. They said, okay, we'll give you access to our unredacted footage. And we had funds to say, okay, well, now you've got to create an actual lab that can work with this footage, that it can, abide by all the security standards, right? That it can, and work with, in a way that produces de-identified data that could then provide meaningful data to an agency to improve their practice. And that's what we did. We did it by transitioning the lens and saying, we've spent a disproportionate amount of our time studying, police by looking at institutional records. We need to supplement that. We need to move to the interaction level. Why? Because that's where the most important decisions are. Right? Very often that are made, it's that officer in that interaction who makes this decision. And we also knew that agencies weren't using the footage. I mean, you look at the, the reports, that Cynthia Lum and the beautiful meta-analysis that her team produced, the work that Mike White has done, out of ASU and others that, we had over a decade of body-worn cameras that have been in use. And across all of this research, what we've seen is that very few are actually using their footage. And why? Well, they didn't have the resources. So what we did is we said, okay, well, what if we become that resource? And so I want to give you just kind of a snapshot. We have been incredibly fortunate to build, from the foundations of the Pullman Police Department, agency with, 30 plus sworn, relatively smaller agency. And from that buy-in, we were able to add 3 large police departments. I think we have 3 small, we now have 4 medium police departments. And we've analyzed, we just did an updated count of 30,000 hours of footage that we process for agencies. We've been able to develop software that we will provide to agencies to be able to use. It was actually designed as software as a service so that the price point is at only the level necessary to maintain and keep upkeep on the software. We did this because we knew the agencies didn't have the tools. They didn't have a resource. This resource was a tool. It's not just the coding hours, right? The human labor of coding it. That we do. But inevitably, the goal is to allow for agencies to be able to integrate this into their practices. To do that, they need tools. We've been able to develop 2 new technologies that allow us to automate the detection of events. And most critically, it's about screening video, right? Because that's one of the challenges is you've got all of it. What do you look at, right? So one of the first technologies that we built and we're working on improving is really, it's an intensity classifier, really segmenting out, okay, let's scan all our footage through. I really want to look at those that are intense, and we'll set aside the non-intense for now. The idea is just trying to categorize the video. Right? So, built on this foundation, for us was being able to integrate students, right? Teaching them how to make sense, to see the data that is contained within this footage. Right? Treating it as very much quantitative data, because one of the values of getting agencies to kind of buy into treating their footage as data was that it's an objective record of what took place. It doesn't explain the why it took place the way that it did, but it's a visual record. Okay, this is what took place. And then being able to model that, to pull out very specific data elements to it. So when we approach agencies, and I kind of have a question to start, and then I'll have a question for you all as we, as we get towards the end, is we like to start with agencies, and we always ask them, set aside the resources. What do you want to learn? And I think there's something very powerful in being able to take a step back and think through, if you could, pull out data from the video of your officers, what would you want? Right? What would you collect? And this takes agencies, and this is probably one of the toughest questions, because they haven't really thought about it. And because it requires reflection. It means you have to take a step back and go, okay, well, what are we good at? And you're all familiar with the good, better, best exercise. So that's, what do you want to get better at? What do you want to be the best at? What aligns with your mission and your vision? And we've worked with agencies, they don't have a mission and vision statement. We say, well, what do you want to get better at? And they go, well, we don't know. I think it's because, those questions require this introspection. It requires, well, it's different to say, well, what do we need for external stakeholders? And what would they like to see? And that is incredibly important. But we know that reform works best, right, when it's co-occurring from outside and inside, and they're working together towards a shared mission and vision. So what we've seen is that when, all the studies that I'm about to walk you through, these are all agency-led. I think that there's something powerful in being able to share out what agencies have, what they've been willing to kind of take that first step and say, we want to know this, we want to get better at this, because eventually we're going to be best at this. And that there's, it requires time. Sometimes we can take an entire year working with an agency. Of course, a lot of it's coming through the city managers and the city attorneys and back and forth on the legal part of it all. but it's the taking time to think through, what is your problem? And is body-worn camera video, is what's contained within it, is that the solution? So I'm going to start with what is the most common, and then I'll walk you through just some of the data elements, some of what can be extracted out, things that you can ask of your agencies to say, have you thought about this? Given the timing of when the lab emerged, kind of post-Ferguson, it was on the minds, use of force, and of course, post Floyd, right, and all these tragedies of dealing around use of force. And so we started thinking about use of force a little differently, which was, well, we have the data on how frequently, right? We have all this research that's really looking at the odds that force occurs, but we really hadn't spent any time thinking about, well, how quickly is that force applied? And so one of the first studies that we were asked to do was, well, let's actually look at the time to force. And this agency said, well, we have been told that our officers use force in a differential way, and it's differential application. And we said, okay, well, one, do you record, is it by policy? Officers have to record, right, go through all the policy. Okay, well, what is your retention flag? Well, we're actually not expunging any of the video right now. We got all of it. So, okay, is it properly flagged? Is it in the system? So we think so. So we did a cross-check. We, ran a random sample of interactions, screened them all to find, okay, well, was there any use of force that was found that was not reported? And so we felt very comfortable to say, okay, well, we're capturing all of it, we'll go through and analyze it. And so we were able to look at, how quickly in that interaction does an officer use force? What's the context of it? How does that relate to officer, the suspect or the person of interest injury? We're able to look at, for the agency, the duration of applied force. If an officer reports using a certain technique, what is the duration of that, right, that application of force? We were able to identify very clear examples of techniques that were being used incorrectly, where they could say, okay, well, we have to do retraining on our techniques. We have to modify our training. We have to implement refreshers because we have officers that are reporting using certain techniques, and those techniques are not working. From that, there's a lot of value. And this was probably one of our most kind of important studies to do, because the agency is able to do this on their own. They already do a use of force review to determine if it's in policy or not. So this was a matter of saying, okay, well, when you do this, right, you have the video, you're going to review the video. Well, why don't you also, at the same time, extract out the following? Right? So now your use of force review will create an objective record, right, of how quickly in that interaction is force used, and the duration and the type, right? All right in the video, it's embedded in the process. So now you're talking about integrating body-worn camera video into an existing practice and extracting out data from within that video that is now meaningful for the organization. The next, well, I guess I should say not the next one we did, but a project that came about, and these are all agency-led. So these are agencies, their ideas, and we work with them to figure out a way to extract the data out of it. The KPIs are the most challenging, and I'm going to come back to this one in a moment. But the idea of the KPIs, it's like, okay, well, what is the expectation that in every interaction that an officer has, right, involving a criminal complaint? So if they initiate a contact, so we're not talking about if an officer decides to, stop at a park, right, or shoot some hoops, right, or goes and has a contact and coffee and meets with a group. They weren't talking about that. We're saying, if an officer has a suspicion of a criminal complaint, right, a code violation, right, what should every officer do? Right? So we're trying to generate, build with the agency these kind of KPIs to say, okay, well, if an officer engages in a traffic stop, what are, these 5 things that every single officer needs to do? This takes the most time because what we've seen is that most agencies don't have this. So how do you know if an officer is within standards? You go, well, what's your policy? It requires them, and so we bring their policies out, we go through them and say, okay, well, what would you expect an officer to do? Right? They can tell you lots of things that they should not do. Right? Incivility, as an example, right? Using directed profanity. These are all things, right, that you would expect the officer not to do. This is saying, okay, well, we can still have those in there, those can be detracted, but really, what should that officer do in every interaction? And this is what I would ask of you all to, think about the agencies that you work with, right? Do they have, a scoring sheet? Do they have some type of performance review that is about at the interaction? And we've seen a lot of agencies that have these wonderful review sheets for their FTO, right? So during the FTO, PTO, right, the trainee gets evaluated, right? So they have the interaction, or kind of, do they do this? How did they talk over the radio? Were they able to actively listen? And they kind of score them on this Likert. And the hard part for agencies here is saying, this isn't a Likert, right? There's still a time and place for this. This is an objective record of, in every interaction, you expect your officer, and they can vary. So, a domestic violence interaction might have a different set of KPIs, and it does, in fact, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But the idea here was, objectively, what do you expect every officer to do? Like, pick 5, like, what are the 5 things that need to be done? 10 things, we're building an instrument. And so we built a few of these over the years. And I think this activity is incredibly powerful because, again, it asks the agency to kind of have this introspection, say, it doesn't matter, right, all of how well they do these things. That can come later. First thing we have to agree on is, here are these 5 things that you are absolutely expected to do. And so I'll give you some examples. Introduce yourself. Here's who I am. Here's why I'm interacting with you. Right, so stating the reason for the interaction, right, explaining it, right, asking for input from the person. And we kind of think of this as elements of procedural justice. Right? This is kind of this transaction that's taking place. And most often we have agencies, they do kind of fall back to this. And yeah, I think that in every interaction, I expect my officers to state who they are, why they're there. Right? And so you can build out, it can be very, it can be 5, it can be 10, but this is the most challenging for agencies. The next study is, and this is one of our larger agencies, they had spent a considerable amount of funds on training, trauma-informed practices, where they really were trying to understand and kind of develop kind of an agency benchmark to say, okay, are our officers adhering to this training? What are they doing, right, when they interact in these particular domestic violence contexts? This was actually led by a former doctoral student of mine, and it was incredibly robust. It took, as you can imagine, a considerable amount of time, but at the end of this, we had this remarkable kind of code book over objectively what an officer has done, as well as what they should not do. Victim blaming language, it's all objective, right? It's not how well the officer did, it's to what extent did they do, right, these specific actions, or we'd consider them to be events. Did they, separate the parties and speak to them? Right? Did they have I'll take an example, a child that translates for both parents? Right? And so many are going, they probably took a snap, like, yeah, like you see, like, don't do these things, right? As well as, hey, these are things that we expect you to do. We expect you to refer the victim for services. that's an objective count. It's, did the officer, right, refer them to services? And so from all of this, what the agency was able to get back was, a report on, here's a snapshot of what is taking place in your domestic violence calls. Here's what officers are doing. Here is what they are not doing. And then breaking that down and looking at, kind of, is there differential treatment? Is there differential treatment in certain neighborhoods, right, among certain individuals, be it based on their race or their gender, right? Are we seeing issues within same-sex partnerships and how officers are engaging in those? So this was, again, remember, these are agency-led, right? And there's, a lot that's contained in these that agencies, we always think of them as being highly risk averse, right? They don't like change. They're not particularly excited when, people come in. And yet here they are asking us to come in because in this case, they didn't know if their training was working. We had a follow-up project from the use of force where we looked at really the role of intensity and emotionality. It was kind of, think about it, emotional regulation and failure. And this was really about understanding kind of agitation and anger, right, that's present in these interactions. This is kind of the precipice of being able to think about, de-escalation and non-escalation. But the first thing we had to figure out was, can we, in a very reliable way, in a valid and reliable way, figure out how to kind of quantify intensity within an interaction? This took us quite a while to figure out. We were able to publish with it. We have others that are now using this. But what this did for the agency is they wanted to understand, what does it look like? Just the level of kind of intensity, emotionality that their officers are experiencing, the community is experiencing, and is it higher in certain areas? And what causes it? Do officers interact in certain communities? Are they just more intense? Because if we know that, we can think about, okay, well, what could we do to try to ameliorate some of that, right? And again, this is all about an opportunity of being able to learn from this. And then this was a really exciting study that one of my new graduate students is fielding right now. We had an agency that said, we want to improve, our mental health context. So, one of the things that we need is we don't have enough interactions where we can train officers on, how to handle these, how to be mindful. It's like everyone's CIT. We've got 100% CIT trained. We've got, everything's going to go through enhanced CIT. So we've got CIT, we've got enhanced, but we need to train. We need more video examples. And so what we did is we ran a random sample of the agency's interactions. We then oversampled based on those emotional regulation failures, kind of finding those intense interactions. And we screened them all for signs of cognitive impairment. And so now what we have is a list of all these videos that have been all pre-screened where there's observable signs of levels of impairment, and it's broken down by all the different types of impairment that are there. So from this, what the agency is able to do, and what we'll go into this next academic year working with them on, is integrating this into their training. But also the first thing is, okay, now they've all been screened and we know the types of impairment. So can we have officers then view these and see how well they pick up on these? So in many ways, once you have this, it serves as a way for us to then be able to then validate our officers detecting this, and then how accurate are they in being able to ascertain the type of impairment, and then do they modify their practices and how they engage in any certain way. And this is an agency seeing an opportunity for what's contained in that data and being able to use it to improve practice. We just actually finished this particular, this was an agency that wanted to understand really their COVID contacts. They had been in the news kind of in terms of how they were managing these particular interactions. And as we all well know, there's whole lots of issues around COVID enforcement and education. And so what we did is we grabbed a sample of all of their COVID contacts. And from this, we were able to really kind of isolate and look at how officers were handling these, how community members were, they were responsive. We were able to break it down into, again, it's not Likert on how well the officers did, how they handled. It's really objectively, what did the officer do or not do in these particular interactions. The thing that was really quite fascinating was the use of minimizing language and how over time that really changed. So you ended up with, at the early onset of COVID, and there's of course, there's all this uncertainty, there's all this we don't know. We had officers, or this agency had officers that were using minimizing language. They would show up at an interaction, they weren't wearing a mask. And if the officer showed up not wearing a mask to a suspected code violation for a COVID-19 ordinance, guess what? That officer was not going to cite. As in, we had not one single interaction where an officer showed up without a mask and then issued a citation. Just never happened. But then over time, right, as we start to become more knowledgeable, as COVID starts to have an impact and we start to see what's happening, as we start to learn, what we saw was minimizing language decreases, mask compliance skyrockets, right? And it doesn't impact what the officer does on scene in terms of, issuing a citation or spending more time educating. By and large, they educated, but even the way in which they educated changed. Right? You can start with the agency saying, we need to know how these are being handled. We have a very big project that is trying to understand, and what the agency wants is they want to understand what is de-escalation. Does it work? Can you de-escalate someone? Can we develop, a body, a kind of a training repository that is specifically about, right, de-escalation? And what we've seen is, and some of this early work we're doing in this agency, we've asked officers to self-report. So they've, identified interactions where the officer believes that they were effective at de-escalating. They, even we've asked for, any effort to de-escalate. It doesn't matter if it worked or not. Most often what we get are all the examples that they send us to say, yeah, they self-identify. Yep, I did it and it worked. And we're like, well, we also want it, the ones where you tried and and it didn't work. So the whole idea here is, we've been able to build out a repository, about 1,500 interactions, and we're going to continue to work through this to objectively try to understand, what does de-escalation look like? When does it occur? What is kind of these cause and effect mechanisms? It is, it's a very, it's a challenging project, and as I'll go into a little bit later, it's challenging because we don't have, a really good operationalization around what de-escalation is. But I think it's worthy to note, because you have an agency, this is one of our larger agencies, and we've got all this data, we've got all this video. There's got to be examples of what's working and what's not working. And if we can learn from that, we can now train our officers to say, hey, we know that in training, we're telling you that this works and it works. Look, like, this is what we're seeing work. Right? Focus on learning from this. And this is a really good example of an agency. We've got this video footage. Okay, so now what do we do with it? And this other project, this was a fascinating one, because we get this quite a lot in the lab, is that agencies will go, do we tell people that we're recording them? And we say, well, what's your policy say? And say, no, we want to know is should we? Should we, and when should we? Right? And say, well, we don't know. And so this project really emerged as an effort to develop, a rigorous kind of evaluation. So, okay, well, if we tell people, it's really about if and how, right? And the idea is here. So what we've done is we've developed very, very brief script, which is essentially, letting people know that, this interaction is being recorded for them, right? And then, providing a card that actually details how they can get access to this recording. And so there's a lot to this particular project because we're trying to understand if we can get funding for it, does this process increase the request for videos? Because we do know that there is a resource burden that's associated with that. But the idea behind this, and we built this out with a few agencies, was, it's, if you think about Ariel's research, how, like, when you tell people has an effect on the interaction, right? So if it's starting to get really intense and you're like, well, I'm recording you, yes, that could be an agitating event. So, at the very start of the interaction, hey, here I'm officer, right? So-and-so, here's why I'm here. I'm recording this interaction for your purposes. If you'd like access to this, footage, here's how you can get access. And so this, really emerged from an agency saying we'd really like to have, some best practices. We'd like to know how, like, when should we tell people? How should we tell people? And, partnering with us to figure out a way to do this. And then for us, we wanted to put it in a randomized control methodology so that we had some rigor and some power to say, absolutely, when you, tell people this way, at the start of the interaction, you make it and frame it about transparency and accountability. It actually maintains a calmer interaction, and it doesn't increase the resource requirements as people start requesting more and more of these interactions. Lastly, this is pretty exciting. We have a few agencies that the idea here is that we're building a training repository that is to enhance the FTO process. This goes a little bit back to the screening that we did on cognitive impairment. But what the agency says is that, we have a lot of interactions. And yet when we've got trainees, we're not getting enough interactions for them, meaning that they finish and then they go out and we're not really confident that they've had enough, kind of experiences. So let's start building a repository of these experiences so that we can have the FTO, go through, watch it, fill out, kind of a brief review, and then talk about those interactions. But the other part of this that's really interesting is that the agency sees this as a value. There's always these shift differences, right? So night shift complains that day shift has no idea what it's like for them. It's like, you don't know what it's like for us. These people are different, right? At night, the context, the frequencies, it's all different. And so the idea is really kind of thinking about organizational cohesion, showing that, while you might be different, the way, there's values in being able to kind of see the different ways that people approach these interactions. I think there's, this one is probably what I'm most excited about because it's about getting officers to say, okay, well, if we're going to train someone, based on your videos, right? What would you want them to see, right? And there's something, of course, on our side, something deeply theoretical in what you bring forward and you want others to train on. But the fact that this is being led by an agency that sees a value in their data to be able to learn from, think about being able to bring in community, right? Being able to think about developing those KPIs with community input, being able to think about developing a training repository of best practices, good practices that have that oversight component to it. There's a real value here. And last is a little bit more a bit of a different one, really about quantifying time. And so the idea was, how much time do officers spend interacting with folks? And as you all might be well versed, there's a whole lot of issues around CAD records and all the variability and what's accurate. But this agency just had a very basic question. I want to know how much time my officers spend talking with community members. That's what I need to know, right? Not when they pull up and shoot hoops. I'm not talking about that. I need to know if we send them out to a call or they initiate a contact. I want to know how much time are they spending there, and do we have any differential patterns based on race, based on gender, neighborhood, contact up. I need to know this. And so this one has not been fun for our students to learn because it's really boring. It's really, you start it, you get the first point of contact, and then you go through all the videos to find the last point of contact, and you've got some basic data. But again, an agency that says, look, there's operational data here that I need. So let's figure out how to extract this data out. Excuse me again. So really all of that, it's about just deconstructing interactions. All those examples, again, agency-led, but it's them saying, let's not just look at good and poor outcomes, because as you all know, you can do everything by policy and you can get a poor outcome. You can make all these missteps, and we've seen it in videos, all these missteps that happen, and somehow it just turns out fine. And so the idea here is, let's actually start to break down what's taking place in these interactions. Right? Let's see what's objectively taking place, pull out those objective time points, and let's work with the agency to allow them to work with their officers to improve. Right? Again, what do they want to get better at? I was going through this, and I'm going to go a little quick because I want to have some time for questions here. We have a very labor-intensive process. We have custom software, there's all this stuff that we've done, and it tends to be a little intimidating for agencies. So we're telling them this, actually, you can do pretty much every single thing that we do with just Excel. Right? We have custom software that we've written. Why? Because we've got to do this with 25 students and make sure that we have integrated reliability for all of our measures, and so we can extract out data, right, as efficiently and effectively as possible. But at the same point for them, Excel works. Why does Excel work? Because it's just a matter of if something happened and when it happened. So really it's just a matter of when did this event, whatever it is. So this example, on use of force that I talked about earlier, we have, agencies, that unfortunately could not work with us, for whatever reason. And I said, well, how could we do what you do? And I said, well, just get yourself an Excel spreadsheet, have your normal metadata on the incidents, and just go through and extract out these particular data points, put them in your spreadsheet, and then go back, look at them, right? Have conversations around, right? When you just build some basic tables and send over, we have these emails we've sent over, like, okay, here's how you do it. Here's Excel, go to this step, build this type of table. Here's where you click. Here's what it looks like, right? It should look like with your data. And it's because they can do it, right? It's in the footage. They just had to figure out how to integrate it into their practice. And then you can get really kind of creative, right? Like you can start from this very basic data, right? You can look at, I have the Terrell and Zimmerman, this resistance force comparative scheme. This is what we have all of our agencies that are doing use of force projects. All of this now gets extracted for them. So they have, levels of resistance. They have the levels of force. We're able to find, right, if it's excessive force, how excessive is it? As well as, remember, now we've contextualized everything. Because what's often, we hear, and you all certainly have heard this, is the pushback that you don't know what it's like, right? And you're right, I don't. I wasn't there, but what I can do is I can say, look, we've accounted for nearly everything we can think of, right? We've got bystanders, were they present? Were bystanders approaching the officer? Were bystanders talking to the officer? What's the environmental noise? So was it incredibly loud, right? Is it on a street? Were there cars moving by? So we code for over 150 events that could happen in interaction. So once we've done all of that, and again, this is one of those things we're an agency probably not going to do. We just need to get them to start here. But once you have all of this, it's incredibly powerful to say that yes, when you are interacting in this neighborhood, right, and this is the demographic characteristics of the person you're interacting with, right, you are 4 times more likely to be higher on this comparative scheme, that your officers do use excessive force. And that's accounting for all of this. And we've done that with agencies, and we've given them those results. And that's incredibly powerful because it's objective data, right? Again, this isn't an assessment of how well we think they did. This is an abstraction, a deconstruction of objectively what took place, when it took place, and how it took place. And I will also add, we do collect obstruction. So if we can't see and we can't hear, we quantify how much time that takes place, because that is really helpful to be able to say, well, how confident are we that we've been able to see and observe all these events? We can quantify that up to say, well, in 5% of those videos, this is how much information is missing. So in general, this is some of the data the agencies can produce, we can produce for them. But that time to force, duration of force, I think is incredibly helpful. I want to get to the questions, so I spent a little bit of time talking about the procedural justice. The really fascinating thing about procedural justice is that you can break it down into a very objective record. And this is kind of, this is one of the KPIs for procedural justice that we put together with three or four different agencies, that they all agreed and said, absolutely, with an officer, initially, this is going to be for traffic stops. So this is everything they expect their officers to do. So we were pretty excited that we got these agencies to all agree and say, yes, this is what we expect our officers to do, as well as we also do not want to see them doing this. And so we collect all of these procedural injustice events, if you will. I already spent some time talking about de-escalation, so I won't spend too much time here. Suffice to say that really with these agencies that are working on de-escalation, we first started with trying to break down, what are we seeing in research, what are we seeing in training, and then building from that. And so actually, I started with a question that we ask agencies, and so I want to kind of end or start a question for you all. It's for the agencies that you are working with that have body-worn camera programs. I would ask of you to ask of them is how are you integrating your body-worn camera into your practices? We have been, I'd say, very fortunate to work with agencies, but something I'm incredibly mindful of is that these are incredibly progressive agencies. Right? These are agencies that come to us because they see the value in it. They realize that we have a resource, we have personnel resources, right? We are using this to train and educate students, work with agencies on training their staff to be able to do this on their own and integrate it in their practices. But there's a whole lot of agencies that can be leveraging the data that's in their footage, and they're not. And I think that is really on all of us, community members, you all in these roles, to be able to ask of them. So you clearly, right, have a body-worn camera program in use, but how are you using it, right? How are you, integrating that into your practices? And I think it does start with that question, right? Like, what do you want to be better at? And is there a value of using body-worn camera video? Not all police departments need a body-worn camera program. And that's where, given the fact that what I do, I'd say, well, everyone needs them. And I'd say, no, I don't think every agency needs a body-worn camera program. I think it's supposed to be a solution to a named and clearly identified problem, right? And what we've seen with body-worn cameras, by and large, they don't have an effect on the meaningful outcomes that we thought that they would. I'd argue, and I continue to argue, that the way that we leverage body-worn camera programs is we have to integrate them into practices. We have to develop new practices for them, because there is a wealth of data that's contained in here that will allow for improving training, improving risk management, right, by way of supervision. And for that, I think it really takes all of us asking agencies, so how are you integrating this program in your practices? And I'll end here. Here's my contact information, we'll share it out. And again, just thank you for allowing me to be here. And again, I apologize that I sound like this. I didn't cough as much, which is really wonderful. And I appreciate you all for your time. Say that.
Thank you so much, David. Thanks for being able to get through that with trying to suppress a cough at the same time. I'm just gonna, if you don't mind, I'm gonna leave your contact information up while we do the questions. And we
Absolutely.
Great. We do have some questions in the queue already. The first one we have is, have you done reviews of how officers are complying with their regulatory policy on body-worn cameras? For example, if officers are using the cameras according to policy, turning them on when they are supposed to, etc.
We have. I think it's a really fun one to do for agencies because you can show them how to do it. And this is one they can do it on their own, right? So they have the record of what's recorded. They have their calls for service or their CAD data that's there. And so we've worked with agencies, show them, okay, well, here's these 2 data sources, download the Excel spreadsheets for them, and then you can run a very quick query to get a compliance rate. And you can say, well, how compliant are officers in that we have a match? We have a video record that's associated with this particular contact. And what's really neat is you can show, here's all of the video records that are associated with this incident. And then what is the duration of time? All of that, depending on the body-worn camera manufacturer, should be readily available in an Excel format. And the CAD records, by and large, are Excel, can be imported in Excel. And then you just simply compare those. So yes, I think it's a very common one. And honestly, I don't know how frequently agencies do those audits. I'll say that most of the agencies that we talk with, at least our agency partners, they weren't doing them regularly. I think it's just they didn't really know quite how to do that. And then if you do, okay, well, what do you do with that particular data? I'm always telling them, look for differential patterns, right? Like, does it vary based on contact type, right? Is there a certain threshold that's acceptable and what's well below that threshold? And then having conversations around that. So there might be a reason that they, a particular, interaction has less likely to be recorded, or there's simply less video that's attached to it. There might be a reason for that. There might not be. First thing, you need the data. And body-worn camera data has a tremendous amount of metadata that's embedded in it that we're able to leverage, but it's not universal. There's no standard with that metadata, which is incredibly difficult to work with.
Great, thank you for that. The next question we have is, how would you suggest incorporating consent decree requirements into this process, especially when findings are geared around excessive use of force?
So I think there are good examples what Seattle did with their body-worn camera program. That with their consent decree, they said, you know what, we're working with justice. We're going to actually look at the footage. We're going to go in and we're going to extract out as much information as we can to be able to see how well aligned that is. I think that if you have a consent decree, you have body-worn camera video, is there, working with a monitor, having those conversations around, okay, well, objectively, what should we be extracting out of these interactions? What should an agency be required to extract out of those? Something that I think is incredibly important is those time elements, right? That resistance, right? Comparative scheme that was there, that absolutely has to be extracted out. And then incredibly so compared to what's in the incident narrative, right? Because what you're looking for is, okay, here's what we've been able to readily observe, and of course, quantifying how much we couldn't see, audio distortions, right? Visual obstruction, jacket over, all those things. Here's how congruent these two pieces of information are. And it's powerful for the community as well to say, well, we have, 9 out of 10 times it's deemed in compliance with use force policy. Well, what does that really mean? Right, so I think that's, hopefully I answered that the way that you're looking for. But I think that, it's really about saying, well, what should be extracted out? One of which is you've got to look at these things. We've seen agencies that they don't, right? It's like there is no requirement to look at it. They could simply go through, read an area, talk to the officer, and be fine. I think at some point, if you have it, you got to have a record that says this was reviewed by this person at this time, and here's what they were looking for.
Great, thank you. The next question is, where have you seen higher variance in behavior, across agencies or across officers in an agency?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. So right now, many of these exist in silos for the agencies. Given confidentiality, we don't try to bring them up. This study we're doing on procedural justice and traffic stops is really the first where we're going to be able to have the agencies see exactly how they compare to each other. I would say that having spent a lot of time watching, I think it's really within the agency, it has been rather kind of intriguing to see how different officers handle interactions, both in their tone, objective. Remember, so we model objective events, and you can see variations on how much time they spend interacting in the community. We just finished a project where we did see neighborhood kind of differential effects based on neighborhood. So I mean, as officers were going to, as they go into certain neighborhoods, they do interact differently, and community members interact differently with them. I think that we often will say, well, of course that's a thing. We've always kind of known that. Do you realize how powerful it is to be able to measure that objectively in data and be able to say, yeah, there are differential effects based on the neighborhood. And so now you know that. Then it's a matter of saying, okay, well, what can ameliorate that? Right? How can we improve the interactions in those communities so that they are less kind of confrontation, right? That officer's tone is not different, right? So how you interact with people, right, is, and, very procedural just, very, equitable, and dare I say the word polite, that how the officer interacts in those communities. Yeah, I think that's by and large what we've seen. But, ask me that again after this next academic year when we're looking at these 4 different departments on procedural justice. This is pretty exciting because it's a mixture of small, medium, and incredibly large, really trying to get a sense of just what does it look like.
Thanks for that. That's incredibly helpful. So I think we have time for a couple more questions. The next one is, you mentioned what the 5 things an officer should do. Introducing self, state the reason for the reaction or the interaction. And then the question is, what was 3, 4, and 5?
Oh, Polly, so they vary always, right?
Okay.
If I can go back to this one, I think this is the one that we had all the agencies agree on. And so I really like this one, right? The downside is we don't want this to be like a script. This is really just kind of, introduce yourself, right? Are they, these agencies all agree that the officers have to say, policy says you have to tell the person that you're recording them, telling them, here's the reason, right? Asking them, for, input. Do they have any questions? Right? So this is what we put together with these different agencies. And I will add that this isn't really kind of a complete sequence, right? So we're looking at when all these things occur. And I think what's really important about this is that because we have the time that all these occur, some of the work that we've done prior, we've seen these elements of procedural justice. Remember, they're procedural justice, and they all occur at the end of the interaction, not the beginning. And so for us, we go, well, that's not procedural justice, right? Like, if 10 minutes in the interaction, you tell me why you're interacting with me, but the whole time I've been asking you why, and you're not going to tell me, you're reluctant to tell me. So this was really about being able to get the agencies to all agree, this is what we believe all of our officers should do. And of course, there's eligibility flags. So, if they don't have to issue Miranda because there's no reason to issue Miranda, then therefore you wouldn't flag an agency, right, for an officer not doing this. But this was the list that we inevitably were able to put together to get the agencies. Again, they all agreed this should happen, and these all things shouldn't happen. But because I told you so is a pretty interesting one. We'd seen that far too often in our coders said, you've got to start coding for this. We're seeing this, it really shouldn't be happening. So we added this in, and our agency partner said, yeah, we really don't want officers doing it, yet we do know that they probably do. So.
Great. Well, with that, I think that we are at time and unfortunately are not able to take any more questions, but there are quite a few in the queue. So I'll forward some of them on to you, David, hopefully for some additional clarification for people. Just from seeing the questions and the interaction on my side of things, it looks like this has been incredibly helpful to our attendees. And I really want to thank you for joining us today and sharing what you're doing at the lab and your insights on this. This is incredibly helpful for the oversight community and law enforcement community. So thank you for that.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure. Please do feel free to email me. I spent a lot of time answering questions and working with folks on how to do this. Yeah, this is not a secret. We're happy to give code books out. Really, we want more people doing what we do, because eventually we'd like to believe that we won't even need a lab, that agencies will just be doing this, and our job is really just to help them to be able to do this. So very proud to be able to share this, and so thank you again.
Well, one more example of those of us trying to work ourselves out of a job, right? So,
nothing wrong with that.
Absolutely. So again, thank you. And just for those of you who are still with us in the audience, I want to remind you that our next webinar in the 2022 series is on August 16th, when we'll welcome Tracy Mears and Jorge Camacho from the Yale's Justice Collaboratory to discuss their work to define state and local authority as it relates to the goals of police reform. Also, please don't forget that registration for our 28th annual conference is now open. The in-person portion of our conference will be held September 11th through the 15th in Fort Worth, Texas. This year's conference will also include 3 one-day virtual components, and more information on the sessions, the schedule, all can be found on napol.org. Thank you again, and I look forward to seeing all of you at our next training event. Thank you. Thanks again, David.